Welcome to Chapter 12 for PSY 235 Social Psychology. In Chapters 10 and 11, you learned about attraction and prosocial behavior. Now we're going to be moving into the darker side and talking about aggression. In this first section of the chapter, you'll be learning about evolutionary, cultural, and learning-based explanations of aggressive behavior with a little bit of a kind of exploration of the cross-disciplinary nature of this kind of research. Before we go any further in terms of exploring these explanations, we need an agreed upon definition of what aggression is. And so psychologists define aggression differently than the way we use the word in everyday speech. For example, it's very important that you distinguish between aggression and, say, being assertive. Aggression, in terms of how psychologists talk about it, it has to be intentional. So the motive matters. It's intentional behavior designed to harm or cause pain, to damage another person. There are a couple of basic forms that this can take. Sometimes aggression is precipitated by anger and hostility. And then that anger and hostility turns into aggression of one form or another. It doesn't have to necessarily be physical aggression. It could be psychological aggression, emotional aggression, or physical aggression. Another type of aggression is instrumental aggression. And here, anger is not the motivator. Hostility is not the motivator. It is aggression used as a means to achieve a different goal. So let's say you're a boxer or an MMA fighter. You're using intense aggressiveness in order to win fame and prize money. That's instrumental aggression. Now let's start our review kind of major theoretical approaches to talking about aggression. The evolutionary approach, and you've been exposed to this in several chapters now, where we've talked about evolutionary theories of attraction, evolutionary theories of prosocial behavior. Now we're going to talk about the evolutionary approach to aggressive behavior. And remember that this approach has its critics. It can be very controversial because the emphasis is typically on sex differences between males of the species and females of the species. So what evolutionary psychologists tend to argue is that physical aggressiveness, so hitting, kicking, punching, strangling, whatever, physical aggression is programmed into males of the species. And they argue that the physical aspects of the male body have evolved to have this aggression as part of what the behavioral patterns require for protecting and defending the group, for bringing down game, and all of that translates into perpetuating genes. So males of the species are argued to commit aggressive acts, particularly physically aggressive acts, for a couple of basic reasons: to show dominance and to achieve status within their social group. And achieving dominance and status is tied to the capacity to control mating, as well as resources. Establishing power and dominance within the social hierarchy means you have more access to eligible females with whom to mate, and you can control them. And even more, you can control other males' access to them. So sexual jealousy is also a motivator, according to evolutionary theory. Now, as I've talked before, these theories are controversial because what evolutionary biologists are arguing is that males have a propensity, based on their evolution, to be physically aggressive as a mating strategy. And some very controversial theorists in this area argue that that's an explanation for sexual aggression. So rape, for example, sexual assault, they argue that males are simply going to be more likely to engage in those kinds of behaviors because evolution dictates it, because it supports their tendency to move in the direction of whatever it is that's going to perpetuate their genes. And their argument is that for males, being physically violent is a means to that end. Now, they also argue that females are more likely to be aggressive under very specific kinds of circumstances, and that's particularly to protect their babies, their offspring. Now, critics of evolutionary theory suggest that both males and females of the species, if you come after their kids, they're likely to get hostile with you. Now, evolutionary theorists have typically focused on physically aggressive behaviors. For females, the fact that females of the species tend to be a bit smaller and less strong, if they're trying to defend their offspring against males, they may retreat instead of attack. So there's this misperception that females are less aggressive, less physically aggressive because they're female. A more nuanced explanation would be that for both males and females, they're capable of a physically aggressive behavior. Females have to strategize a bit more often because they're significantly more likely to be victimized by males who are bigger and stronger than they are. Going hand in hand with the evolutionary theory, there's been a lot of interest in the impact of testosterone on aggressive behavior, particularly physically aggressive behavior. The common assumption is that testosterone is the fuel behind male aggressive behavior. And, males of the species, of the human species, do tend to have higher levels of aggression than females of the species. It's also been suggested that males and females who have very high testosterone are likely to be more irritable, more angry, more hostile, and more aggressive. Now, the question is, how true is that? And it's really tricky research to do. It's ethically challenging to put people in an experimental situation where they are being asked to engage in aggressive behavior, or they're put in a situation where it's likely. It's also ethically dicey to give people hormones that have lots of potential side effects. As a result, a lot of this research has been done in non-human animals, most often in, not even in primates, but in rodents, in rats and mice, for example, whose behaviors are, different from ours. So I want you to think very critically and carefully about the nature of this research. A lot of what we know about the link between testosterone and aggression is that the correlation is impacted by the social situation that surrounds that relationship. So while we can say globally, yeah, maybe there's a correlation between testosterone and aggression. However, human beings have the capacity for thought and judgment. That means they're going to be influenced by the social situation, and in fact, their behavior may change based on the situation that they're in. There are a lot of hypotheses that are connected to the evolutionary argument. One of these hypotheses is the challenge hypothesis, which suggests that testosterone and aggression, the correlation between the two of them, that's going to be stronger when there are opportunities for reproduction. So the argument here is, if you have high testosterone males and they are in the presence of potential mates, they will challenge one another physically in order to win the female and the opportunity to mate with her. Now, I can guess you're imagining a bar situation where you have, some guys and they're all looking at the same woman and they're thinking, and the challenge hypothesis would say that the higher the testosterone in that challenge moment, the more likely you're going to have physical outbursts. Now, most of this research has been done with non-human animals, like putting a couple of boy rats in a cage and, manipulating the level of testosterone in their systems. And what's been found is that when it's just the guy rats and they're hanging out, you have a lower level of physical aggressiveness. If instead you put a female in their presence, even just the smell of one, that's when they're likely to act out, and the correlation between testosterone and aggression will matter in that kind of context. But for humans, we can't really test that experimentally, either because of practical concerns, but also because of ethical concerns. Another kind of hypothesis that goes hand in hand with evolutionary theory is this idea that there's an interaction between testosterone and cortisol, which is a stress hormone. So cortisol levels go up when we're super stressed out. They go down when we're not stressed. The argument here is that the level of testosterone is going to be more strongly correlated to dominance behaviors under low stress conditions. So basically, if you're in a high stress situation, behaving aggressively is not necessarily the default option. Being under stress is very consuming. It's very mentally consuming. So the argument based on this hypothesis is that when we are overstressed, it may actually override those dominance behaviors where you're fighting with others in order to access mates. Because if you're in a high stress situation, mating may not be your high priority. And then finally, testosterone, it has been found to predict aggression when there's something to gain. And again, this is based in this idea of the evolutionary argument. When we have, in some of the research comes from athletics, but that's really complicated and hard to interpret data. So a lot of the research comes from non-human species, and there you're getting into a dicey situation of trying to make inferences about human behavior based on the behavior of non-human species. There is some evidence, though, that when people have higher testosterone and they're given a handy motive, that aggression will go up. So that relationship between testosterone and aggression tends to be stronger when it's instrumental aggression. Now, one instrumental reason for being aggressive is seeking access to mates. So you can see why this is consistent with that evolutionary approach. Since I've talked about non-human species a fair bit, it's important to look at some examples, some concrete examples in some of our closest relatives. So among primates, what we know is that, aggressive behavior is highly tied to the context, the nature of the social structures that are involved in primate social living situations. And that was a really convoluted sentence that made very little sense. I'll try to do better. So aggressive behavior for humans is highly connected to the context, to the situation. Same goes for other primates. So when we look at two different primate species, and think of it from this approach that research with non-human animals shows that certain aggressive behaviors don't need to be learned. They're instinctive. Other types of patterns of behaviors are dependent on the structure of the situation that these animals are in. But let's focus on those not learned sort of patterns. Chimpanzees, while they have, highly sophisticated social interactions and behaviors, and they can be quite cooperative and kind to one another, chimpanzees are really well known for aggressive patterns of behaviors, for being kind of assaultive and violent on occasion. They kind of have that in common with humans. What's been found in many groups of chimpanzees is that they are capable of showing very organized aggressive behavior. Like, it's been documented that particularly groups of male chimpanzee societies, I guess is a word to put, in the social group in which they live, they will collectively go out and hunt and kill other chimpanzees. It's usually when they're being challenged, challenged for access to mates, challenged for access to territory, and so on. But that has been documented as something that has occurred. And also just in chimpanzee groups, there's a lot of just grousing and fighting and irritability that's characteristic of interactions among males. And sometimes actions taken by males against females within those chimpanzee groups. Now, bonobos, another primate pictured at the bottom right hand of your screen, bonobos, and I'll challenge you, if you want to get a little dose of bonobo behavior, just look them up on YouTube. Basically, bonobos engage in a whole lot of activities that in other contexts, with other species, might lead to a lot of conflict. Meaning they have a lot of sex. They have sex with everybody. And it doesn't matter whether they're not really depending on procreation being the outcome. They just have a lot of sex. It seems to diffuse conflicts. So it's like if there's a tussle, it often culminates in sexual behavior and grooming behavior. So unlike chimps, bonobos tend to be in these matrilineal organizations. So there's female dominance within their groupings, and the males are often kept in line by that structure, and just the constant sexual behavior tends to keep everybody chill. It's really something to see. Now, chimpanzees, on the other hand, their social organizations tend to be very hierarchical, with a male at the top. So a big silverback male, an older male who's demonstrated his dominance by fighting off other males and being in constant disagreement with other males, and also demonstrating dominance with the females in his group that he has access to for mating, and spending a lot of energy and time controlling the other males so that they don't have access to the females that he wants sole ownership of. And this extreme hierarchy can also involve killing babies. So if, say, a male is concerned that the females, like if he comes in and he has taken over, he's dethroned the male in the troop, he may go around and kill the babies so that the new babies will only be his. So it really depends on the nature of the social organization with that species. Let's shift our attention to what kind of research has been done looking at cultural variables. Most social psychologists, since we're all about the social situation, agree that aggression is one of many options that humans have for behaving. We can choose whether or not to behave aggressively, or we can choose passive approaches to dealing with conflict. So it's an optional strategy. Humans are born, in other words, with the capacity to be violent, but we're going to make some decisions about when and where and how to express it, and that all really boils down to what does your culture say about what's appropriate in various circumstances. For many animal species, regardless of whether they're humans or non-humans, there's a tendency to attack other animals that invade their territory. Now, for humans, though, we get to decide what the rules of that invasion are and what behaviors warrant aggression and what behaviors do not warrant aggression. So it really, for many species, it's pre-programmed. For non-human animal species, it may in fact be instinct driven to attack an invader. For humans, while we may way back in our evolutionary history have that kind of instinct, we don't have that instinct anymore. What we instead have is a great big frontal lobe that says, okay, what are the norms, values, and rules about this? What are the demands of this particular situation? And that leads into, really thinking about the big picture. How have patterns of aggressive behavior, patterns of violence changed in the human species across time and when we compare across cultures? Within a given culture, social conditions can change. And what many historians as well as social psychologists have been able to show by really digging into the historical record is that aggressive behavior has changed a lot across the history of the human species. Steven Pinker in particular has done some of this research and has been able to show that over the millennia of time, so over the centuries, aggressive behaviors, things like murder, assault, torture, war, crimes, all that stuff, while it's still here, undeniably, it's still present, it's been declining over time. So over the centuries, these patterns of behaviors have decreased. He argues that, right now, in comparison to the long ago past, we as a species are less violent, we're less cruel, and we're actually more peaceful. And I know that that flies in the face of what the news media and the social media environment throws at us every single day. But he's like, take the big bird's eye view, look across centuries of time. We're actually less violent now than we were in the 1800s. And we were less violent in the 1800s than we were in the 1700s, and so on. He argues that what changed was the nature of the civilizing process, if you will. So when we form communities, we form cultures, then we form nation states and governments that have rules of law, systems of values, and also, most of these nation states have some articulation of what rights human beings have. And over time, that belief that human beings have rights has expanded, has become more significant with time. The cultures, and another way that Pinker looks at this is to compare cultures. The more a culture has norms, values, and laws that emphasize cooperation and collectivist values, the lower their levels of aggressive behavior. So when you compare, for example, Western European-based cultures, like, the United States at the present time is a Western European-based culture. So if you look at Western and Northern Europe, the US and Canada, we tend to be less cooperative and collectivistic. We tend to be more individualistic and competitive. Individualistic and competitive cultures tend to have higher rates of aggressive behavior than cooperative collectivist cultures do. It's not that there's zero in those collectivist cultures. There's still murder, there's still rape, there's still homicides, there's still all kinds of nastiness. It's just lower. The rates are overall lower in those cultures. Now, another line of research that's frankly pretty controversial, and it tends to get under people's skin pretty rapidly, and you'll see why, is this idea that there are cultures of honor. This research came largely out of sociology, a little bit out of criminology, where researchers were tracking patterns in different regions of the United States. They were really looking at patterns of physically aggressive behavior, particularly criminally aggressive behavior. And they also wanted to kind of look at what kinds of events were triggering factors in those physically, criminally aggressive behaviors. And what they found were patterns of regional differences in the record. So what kind of data were they really looking at? They were looking, one example is homicide rates. And they also looked at other kinds of non-homicide physical assaults, and so on. And what they found was that when they were specifically looking at white men in the South and the Southwest, especially in rural areas, the homicide rates were higher than for white men in other regions of the country. And, the theory that they have proposed, and this is where the controversy comes into play, the theory that they proposed was that the South and the Southwest are tied culturally to this historical culture of honor, where disputes between people were disputes about the reputation of the man who owned the property. And that included, home and family and livestock and land. When challenged, that man would be expected to defend his own and his family's honor in order to restore status or to maintain status. They argue that these regions have these honor-related homicides, meaning somebody has insulted the family. even though they are long disconnected from the origins of that culture of honor, which was in the way back times. Think about Western movies, where you have people out on the frontier and they're constantly in conflict with each other over land, over grazing rights, over access to women, whatever. The argument that these researchers make is that the legacy of that culture of honor is stronger in the South and the West of the country, particularly in those rural spaces. Now, why is this controversial? Because it makes people living in those regions seem to be unnecessarily aggressive and violent. As a result, these theories have come under fire for their particular interpretation of that increased homicide rate for white males in those spaces. What some of the critics argue is that you're missing a lot of other potential explanatory variables that could come into play. Now, a similarly controversial area is research looking at sex and gender differences. And for the purposes of our discussion here today, a lot of the research in this area didn't really tease apart the differences between sex, which we typically use to talk about male versus female differences that are biologically based, versus gender, which is a culturally derived way of describing masculinity and femininity. A lot of this earlier research really didn't differentiate the two and kind of lumped them together. So your authors are going to talk about gender differences and sex differences kind of interchangeably, which frankly I find confusing, but I just wanted to put that disclaimer out there. Some of this research is focused specifically on intimate partner violence, so violence that's perpetrated in the family, and also, mixed in there with intimate partner violence is violence against children within the family. And what we know from both, archival research, criminologic research, as well as social psychological research is that most cases of extreme violence that take place in a family context are perpetrated by the males in the family. And we also, going hand in hand with that is, when men are physically assaultive without weapons, just with their hands, when they beat people up, they tend to inflict more harm than women who become physically aggressive. Now, there's a simple explanation for that. On average, males tend to be bigger and stronger, and they get more practice being physically assaultive than females. Males are encouraged from a very early age in American culture to engage in physically aggressive play. Girls tend to be discouraged from doing so. Now, culturally, those messages are starting to get messier. We see more models of females behaving physically aggressive, and they're being valued for doing so, simultaneous with being criticized for doing it. But we're starting to see some shifts where when we look at the criminal justice data and look at juveniles, for example, females, young girls who are under 18 are starting to close the gap with boys in terms of engaging in physically assaultive behavior. The cause is, regardless of whether you're talking about males or females, men or women, what triggers their aggressiveness within their families, it's the same for both sexes. You have sexual jealousy, you have anger over situations in the family, anger over behavior of children, anger over not being home when you're supposed to be home, anger over slights and misunderstandings. Sometimes physically aggressive behavior can be done for attention-seeking reasons or for getting revenge or self-defense, depending on the situation. Now, in terms of impact, though, if you're talking about a heterosexual relationship where both the male and the female are engaging in physically aggressive behavior, the females are likely to get hurt worse in those situations. If you look at non-heterosexual relationships, these same kinds of situations are the ones that trigger abusive or aggressive behavior. So it doesn't matter whether you're gay or straight. in your closest relationships, there are the potential for these triggering factors to lead to aggression. You can't simply say it's because men are men and women are women. Men are going to be more violent. That's too simplistic an explanation for us to rely on. What we have to rely on are what are the norms and values, what are the expectations, what are the learning histories that preceded the way people behave in their intimate relationships. One thing that's been found is that provocation is sort of an equal opportunity precursor to the willingness to inflict harm. So when provoked, it doesn't matter if you're male or female, if somebody provokes you, the willingness to harm someone physically is about the same. Now, impact, that's another issue. Males of the species tend to be bigger and stronger, so that they're likely to inflict more harm when provoked than females. Females will want to do the same amount of harm, but they may not necessarily be able to inflict it, especially if the person they're attempting to inflict it on is a larger, physically stronger individual. And then finally, if you are in a cultural space where there's a lot of admiration for physical aggression, and a lot of the United States is like that, we tend to be a violent culture. We tend to have a lot of violent role models, and we tend to value those violent role models. We see images of aggressive, dominant males and females in our popular culture, and we tend to value them. So both sexes are going to be more likely in a culture like ours to rely on aggressive tactics to get what they want. They may show it in different ways, in different patterns, but in a culture like ours, we are a violent culture. We tend to admire people who are able to pull off a physical attack and win. And that tends to make us significantly more likely than other cultures to engage in physically violent behaviors. Now, another gender-related area of research is in the expression of what's called relational aggression. Relational aggression refers to using non-physical tactics to harm other people. So the stereotypical version of it, as was seen in the classic movie Mean Girls, involves things like rumor spreading, reputation damage. More modern kinds of examples would be sharing pictures and videos online of that person in a compromised position, revenge porn. All kinds of things like this are considered to be relational aggression. Now, the stereotype is that girls and women are significantly more likely to commit relational aggression than males. There is some research that shows that those patterns have some validity. So if we look specifically at females, especially, most of this data comes from white females who are middle class and above, we can show that in comparison to white males, girls are significantly more likely and women are significantly more likely to do things like the following: being manipulative, talking behind someone's back, spreading false rumors about the target, shunning, excluding, and reputation harm. Now, one of the difficulties has been that the types of behaviors that have been measured tend to skew feminine. And that means you may be missing relational aggression behaviors that are more common with men. With men, it's not that they're not relationally aggressive. They absolutely 100% are. It's just more of a trash-talking variety, like making fun of and teasing and bullying lesser males. Or if they are in competition with a male for the affection of, say, a girl, they may go after them in terms of belittling them, challenging their sexuality, spreading rumors about their ineptitude in sexual situations. In terms of their interactions with their partners, We have evidence in heterosexual relationships that males engage in all kinds of relationally aggressive behaviors. Oftentimes in terms of gaslighting and manipulation, but also when people break up, engaging in these things, like the classic example these days is revenge porn, sharing pictures of your ex naked, sharing videos of your ex in sexual situations or in really embarrassing other kinds of situations, and sharing it widely on social media. This has been found in a lot of different research with kids, with adolescents, and with adults. So I think there's a kernel of truth. Girls and women in their interactions with other girls and women tend to use a lot of relational aggression strategies. And in their relationships that are heterosexual with men, they tend to use a lot of relational aggression patterns, especially if their partner is bigger and stronger than them. It may be the only pattern that they can use safely to be aggressive with another person. So it's not that men are incapable of it. I've seen a lot of relationally aggressive men, and I've seen a lot of physically aggressive women. It's just that on average, girls and women are more likely to use relational tactics. Boys and men are significantly more likely to use physical tactics. But both men and women are completely capable of doing both kinds of aggression. Now we're going to shift to learning theory and how learning theory has addressed the topic of aggression. We're specifically going to talk about social cognitive learning theory, or it's also known as social learning theory, or just cognitive learning theory, whichever one you want to use. The argument behind social cognitive learning theory is that we learn complex social behaviors like aggression by observing and imitating others. Bandura in particular and his colleagues did a long line of research to demonstrate the power of social learning in aggressive behavior. Now the picture on the left side of your screen is of the infamous Bobo doll. I actually had one of these when I was a kid growing up in the 70s. It's basically an inflatable life-size clown who has a squeaky toy nose that you can punch and make it squeak. The bottom is weighted with sand, so you punch it, it falls over, and then it bounces back up and comes back for more. I know, great toy for kids. We had a lot of fun with it, my brothers and I. What Bandura did in his classic research was to show that when you give kids a model who's behaving aggressively, and the prop that they used was a Bobo doll, so it became the Bobo doll study, they're more than capable of reenacting what they see. Now, before we get into some archival footage where Bandura talks to us about how he ran his study, what does it take to learn observationally? So what are the elements? The learning process in observational learning starts with attention. You have to pay attention to the behavior, you have to watch it and observe it. Then you have to retain it. You have to remember what you saw. Then you have to be able to reproduce that behavior. Depending on the physicality of the learner, depending on the situations and the scripts that were displayed, you have to be able to physically reproduce the behavior. And then finally, you have to be motivated to do so. So observational learning requires all of these elements. It requires the cognitive components of attention and memory, and then it requires the behavioral components of being able to reproduce the pattern, but you have to also be motivated to do it, which requires that you pay attention to whether or not the consequences are positive or negative for that behavior. So here's some archival footage with Bandura narrating.
The segment you're about to see is taken from an early experiment on learning of aggressive styles of behavior through modeling. Children watched a filmed adult perform novel aggressive acts toward a inflated doll, and the physical aggression was accompanied by novel hostile remarks. We later measured how much of this modeled aggression the children had learned just by watching. Now, the measurement of learning of aggression uses simulated targets rather than live ones. For example, to test how well bombardiers have learned bombing strategies, you would use simulated targets rather than require them to bomb San Francisco or New York. The model pummeled the doll with the mallet, flung it in the air, kicked it repeatedly, threw it down and beat it. It was once widely believed that seeing others vent aggression would drain the viewer's aggressive drive. As you can see, exposure to aggressive modeling is hardly cathartic. Exposure to aggressive modeling increased attraction to guns, even though it was never modeled. Guns had less appeal to children who had no exposure to the aggressive modeling. The children also picked up the novel hostile language. The room contained varied play materials, and children could choose to play aggressively or non-aggressively. The children devised new ways of hitting the doll. Now, the object of interest was the novel aggressive acts, not punching the doll. The children in the control group, who had no exposure to the aggressive modeling, never exhibited the novel forms of aggression. Here's a creative embellishment. A doll becomes a weapon of assault.
So that's the basics of the Bandura paradigm. So when we're looking at imitation and aggression, what Bandura was able to show by having an adult, a live model in the first iteration of the study, they had that live adult, after being, in a provocation situation, knock around a plastic air-filled Bobo doll, and enact a script where they used specific words and phrases when they were beating up the Bobo doll. Then the kids were given the opportunity to play with the doll. In those experiments, the children did tend to imitate the aggressive models. Even the kids who chose not to, the ones who were exposed, not all of the kids imitated the model, just a lot of them did. The ones who didn't engage in the behavior, when they were asked to show the researchers what they saw, they were fully capable of acting out what they saw. The children in the control condition who didn't see the aggressive adult in action almost never showed any aggression toward the doll that was beyond the intended purpose of the doll. So the whole purpose of the toy is to punch the squeaky toy noise. So those kids did do that, but they didn't do any of the novel aggressive behaviors like using other toys from the room, tackling the doll, kicking the doll, punching the doll, using other objects in the room to hit the doll, and so on. So it's really about those novel aggressive behaviors that they elaborate, that they build on to the additional, they build on as an additional sort of enactment. In other versions of the study, Bandura went beyond the live model to have a televised, a recorded version of the adult on film, because there was a lot of debate already about TV violence and exposure to children. And then they also did animated versions of the manipulation, and they found basically the same results. So kids were not distinguishing between a live model, a videotaped model, or an animated model. It didn't really matter. As long as they were acting it out, they could imitate it. Now, Bandura was also able to show that if the model was punished, had really bad outcomes, the children would refrain from acting out the aggressive script. If the model was shown getting rewards, they became even more likely to act out the aggressive script than they did previously. So that shows that these children were paying attention to consequences and motives in their enactment of the behavior. Bandura and his colleagues also said, well, what will happen if you expose kids to non-aggressive models? And what they found was that if children watched other children behaving peacefully, even when provoked, they were found to engage in more peaceful behaviors. Later, when they were put in the same kind of provocation situation, they were much less likely to behave aggressively than children who had not seen the non-aggressive model. And Bandura did this similarly. The study that's described in your text is about kids watching other kids. Bandura did it with the adult model too. If the adult model was shown having been provoked, made angry, but then engaging in peaceful behavior, like interacting with the toy in a positive way, saying, "Aren't you the cutest clown? I'm going to dance with the clown." So when they were shown that, the children tended to follow that model as well. Now we can also look at some of the physiological variables that have found to be associated with or predictive of aggressive behavior. Alcohol is certainly a predictor of aggressive behavior for some people, not all. Aggression, though, is a substance that can lower our inhibitions, it can reduce our anxiety, and it can also make us less cautious and less risk averse. So basically, people will put themselves in less safe situations. They may respond aggressively. Generally speaking, when people are already prone to aggressiveness, alcohol tends to make them more so. If people are prone to passivity, alcohol can actually disinhibit them and make them a bit less or more likely to be aggressive, or it can enhance their tendencies toward passivity. So it's not 100% predictive. It's like alcohol doesn't turn on an on switch, but it can, in fact, make people's inhibitions lower. And situational cues can then become predictive of aggressive behavior. Pain is another predictor. Regardless of species, organisms, when they're in pain and they can't escape, are more likely to lash out. So humans, when they're in pain, ask anyone who works in medicine. People can be really horrible when they're in pain, and they can actually become assaultive when they're in significant pain as well. Like with alcohol, though, effects of pain vary tremendously from person to person. Some people, when they're in a lot of pain, just sort of close in and become even more passive and less likely to act out. Some people, though, when they're in pain, they become angry, irritable, and easily provoked. So it depends person to person. Researchers have also tested all kinds of ways of making people uncomfortable, both in the laboratory and in the field, by making rooms really hot, making them humid, making them smelly and disgusting, putting people in crowds, putting them in high pollution environments. All of these things are correlated with higher rates of aggressive behavior. And that concludes my coverage of Learning Objective 12.1. In the next video, we'll cover Learning Objective 12.2, describe situational and social causes of aggression.